Welcome to SUP, the Super Urban Podcast, a discussion on cities coming from RMIT Architecture and Urban Design in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I'm Ian Nazareth.
I'm Graham Christ.
And I'm Christine Phillips.
As we walk around built-up cities of today, it's easy to forget that nature laid the groundwork long before the first brick was laid. Ancient volcanic eruptions shaped the land and waterways we now build around. These deep-time forces still influence where we place our cities and how they grow. And as cities grow, natural environments become increasingly altered, sometimes beyond recognition. But nature continues to exert a powerful influence on the shape and size of cities. In an era of climate crisis, we are waking up to just how powerful that relationship still is. Today, we're diving into the deep history of Melbourne, also known as Naarm, with Dr Gary Presland, who quite literally wrote the book on the subject, The Place for a Village, How Nature Has Shaped the City of Melbourne. For those outside Australia, Melbourne, Naarm, sits on the southeast coast and is Australia's second most populous city. But long before skyscrapers and laneways, this was Kulin Nation land, home to the Boon Wurrung and Wurrung peoples, who cared for its rivers, grasslands and volcanic plains for tens of thousands of years. The city as we know it was laid out in a grid beside the Birrarung, what many know as the Yarra River. Today, it's easy to forget just how deeply nature has shaped this place. But that's exactly what we're here to explore.
Dr Gary Presland is a non-Indigenous Melbourne Naarm-based writer and historian that studied history at La Trobe University and archaeology at the University of London. His major research interests have been in Aboriginal and natural history of the Melbourne area, and Gary has written many terrific books including Aboriginal Melbourne, The Lost Land of the Kulin People, also For God's Sake, Send the Trackers, The First Peoples of Melbourne, Port Phillip and Central Victoria, the Eastern Kulin, and not forgetting The Place for a Village, How Nature Has Shaped the City of Melbourne, just to name a few, which will be the main focus of our discussion today.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Gary Presland. Can you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and what first sparked your interest in natural history, and what indeed natural history is?
Thank you, Christine, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I grew up for the first 10 years or 11 years in the Hunter Valley, where my father's family had lived for 101 years before I was born. But my mother came from Melbourne, and so there was an ongoing argument within the family as to where we should be living. And ultimately my mother won, and we moved to Melbourne, but not for very long, because my father was a dairy farmer, and living in the city was not his go. But so we moved up to near Echuca. Ultimately, my parents separated, and the situation that I found myself in was too much for me, so I ran away to sea at the age of 16. I did, after 10 years, decide that there wasn't a great future in this, and so I talked my way into La Trobe University. And as Andrew said, I studied history. I then studied archaeology and came back to Australia and worked as an archaeologist. And it was there, I was a consulting archaeologist. This was in the early 80s, and I was given a job to do an archaeological survey of the Melbourne metropolitan area. And I very quickly learnt a great deal about Melbourne, largely I didn't know because, of course, I hadn't really grown up here. So I learnt about not only about the indigenous people of the area, the First Nations people, the Kulin, and particularly the Wurrung and Boon speaking people, but I learnt also about the natural history of the area, and I came to realise that one cannot speak about indigenous culture or indigenous people without also talking about their country, because from their point of view there is no meaningful distinction to be made. This is in direct contrast to the view of nature that Europeans have for many years, probably principally since the Renaissance time. We have regarded nature as a commodity, and so natural history nature is something that can be used towards the ends of whatever humans want to achieve. The study of natural history is the study of every living part of history, but also, of course, it includes things like geology. So it's the total, and natural history was the precursor of all of the natural sciences that we now have fragmented into. We've specialised so that there are geologists, biologists, botanists, but once upon a time people were simply natural historians. And it was then that at the end of that 12-month survey that I'd done, that I decided that I knew enough about the natural history of Melbourne to try and recreate what it was like at the time that Europeans arrived.
So Gary, before we embark on the specifics of how nature has shaped the city of Melbourne, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on natural history in relation to climate change. And we recently had Indy Johar on the Super Urban podcast. He's an architect and co-founder of Dark Matter Labs. So Indy talks quite directly about climate change as being, I guess, symptomatic of an old world view where humans have radically altered the natural environment in which we inhabit for their own benefits, and puts forward a sort of hypothesis that we are now living in a transition period that he explains takes place about every 400 years, where we have begun to change our perception of how we exist in the world. I guess certainly there has been a growing interest in architecture for how we can design for non-human entities, and what carbon impact of construction is, and how we need to consider the relationships of our constructed environments in relation to greater ecological systems, along with how we might learn from indigenous knowledges to assist us with this transition. What are your thoughts on the role of understanding natural histories within this context?
Well, in today's world, natural history is the province primarily of untrained non-scientists. That's not to say that scientists can't be natural historians, but because of their training, they specialise in a particular area. Mm-hmm. So, for example, there are in every state of Australia there are natural history clubs or organisations. I'm a member of the Field Naturalist Club of Victoria, for example, and that is the oldest of its kind in Australia. 1880 it was formed, and it consists largely of people who are essentially amateurs. They're ordinary working people, and they have an interest in some part of nature. It might be fungi, or it might be insects. It can be marine things. So natural history for them is like a hobby almost, a pursuit. We don't, and I don't think that by and large, in my experience at the Field Naturalist Club, I'm both the librarian, the archivist, and I edit I'm one of the editors of the journal which the club publishes, but there is very little time or talk spent about the impact of climate change. It certainly is being felt by the people who are at the cutting edge of the different sciences. We're talking about, we get papers published, for example, in the journal on the difficulties caused by relocating animals,
Right.
reptiles and frogs, for example, are being, because they're affected by the impact of climate change, they're being relocated to other areas. But that in itself brings problems, and it's at about that sort of level that natural history, sort of, if you like, natural history and climate change meet.
Well, I think if we go back to your point about your early research in this area and how you discovered the importance of understanding Australia's First Peoples in relation to surrounding landscapes and that interconnectedness of First Peoples with the land around them, with the waterways, with animals and so forth. We seem to be in a time where there is, maybe we could call it an awakening or a shifting of perhaps a European or a Western view where there was that separation. We understood nature as being a commodity separate to human way of life. But there is now an interest in global, really, but in Australia, certainly of design practitioners and all sorts of different fields, understanding the need to gain a deeper understanding of the interrelationships between people and their environments. So I'm wondering if, do we need to actually go back and reflect on a deeper history and understanding of place in order to move forward?
Well, that would be a good thing, but I think totally impossible because the driving force in our society is economics. And so whatever we do has some economic outcome. And the concerns about climate change, it seems to me, focus on whether where you can build your house. We have to be aware that, and we are regularly being reminded that the ice caps, for example, at the polar ends are melting, and so the sea level is rising. So people cannot build close to as close to the ocean as they want. But that, of course, is really to do with where people are living rather than what their connection with nature is. Nothing, I think, even for I think the people who are being affected most in terms of their connection to country must be the farmers, because of course climate change is bringing, as we now, at this very moment, we have drought here in Victoria and flooding in New South Wales, and flooding and drought are not new things, but if they are becoming more frequent, then they are affecting the people who are producing the food.
That's right.
And that's once again that's an economic consideration.
So it's a fait accompli for you. We're not going to move past this. I think Indy Johar takes a bit of a more provocative stance in saying we need to shift that view, but I hear you loud and clear on your view. I think, speaking about the floods that are currently taking place and all of these, very extreme climactic conditions are reminders of the environments around us. And in your book, Place for a Village, How Nature Shaped the City of Melbourne, you shared two very powerful examples of places that exist within Melbourne that stand as reminders of that deep time history of this place that we now call Melbourne Naarm, of a history that existed long before humans occupied this place. And these images have always, really stuck with me. One is a very captivating image you include in the book of the Eastern Freeway cutting in North Boon that exposes a section of basalt that flowed across the landscape around 1 million or so years ago. And I've always, every time I drive down the Eastern Freeway now, I think about that deep, long time. And the other is of Queen's Bridge, which today shares the same pedestrian route that the city's first residents, the Wurrung and the Wurrung, took to cross over the Yarra, the Birrarung River, but was also once home to falls that were formed because of geomorphic events that took place.
Yes.
And I think, it's about paying attention to those moments, those places that exist, that can help us give a better understanding of place. I wondered if you could, and this is a big question, give us a snapshot of a few of the major geomorphic events and processes that took place across Victoria that ultimately led to the shaping of the landforms and waterways in the region that we now know as Melbourne Naarm, because I think we often forget about that deep history.
Yes. Well, this is a complicated story, of course. Basically, there are 5 different geological formations underlying Melbourne, the metropolitan area of Melbourne. The oldest of all, about 440 million years old, is basically a sandstone, mudstone formation, which is referred to as Silurian. That is the geological period in which it was laid down. It was laid down underwater, and then subsequently, as the continents broke up and lifted out of water, and it became highly eroded, and then geological forces squeezed it. And so that's why we see in the cutting that you referred to, for example, we see the layering, which ought to be was originally completely vertical. We see it running at angles. Now that occurred. That was laid down 440 million years ago, or thereabouts. But subsequent to that, there was further incursions by. Well, it was underwater. The area became covered with water again, so further sediment was laid down, and we find that that's on top of what was there. most of that was mostly eroded. You find it only in the southern suburbs, and that is what used to be called. I'm having a senior's moment. I can't think of what it is, but it's only about 40 million years old.
Right.
But it's sandstone, and there were 3 separate phases. There were 2 periods in which it was laid down when it was open to the air, so it's windblown or shifted by water flowing in, and in between there is a layer which was deposited while it was underwater. Now, in some areas, in some parts of Melbourne, these zones constitute the high points of the landscape. There is also, it used to be thought that there were 2 separate periods of volcanic activity with volcanoes. They didn't erupt it like as in Vesuvius. They just cracks opened in the earth and lava flowed out in the foothills of the Dividing Range. But they flowed to the south and flowed across the area that is now northern Melbourne and all of the western side of Melbourne, west of the Wurrung River and north of the Yarra River. Mm-hmm. It used to be thought that there was an older volcanic and a newer volcanic, but it seems now that it was probably only one with an interregnum. So we have some features, for example, Batman's Hill, what's left of it, a ridge around the top of the bay, which is and Emerald Hill, which is now South Melbourne. This is the older end of the volcanic period. The newer volcanics take up all of the surface area in the northern suburbs of Melbourne and all of the western suburbs all the way to South Australia. And on top of that, there is areas where they've been subject to inundation sufficiently regularly to deposit soil, which has become a layer. So those are the 5 layers,
right?
And each of those has a particular place within the history of Melbourne.
Because I think we've come to know Melbourne as a bluestone city.
Yes.
So how is that connected, or is that a bit of a myth, or?
It's a bluestone city because all of the area of the Western Plains,
so that's from
west of Melbourne, the Wurrung River, and to some extent around places like Preston and in that area, there were basalt quarries.
So that's from the basalt.
And so that was the source of the many of the public buildings. The fancy, they were the public buildings such as, say, the old Melbourne Jail and the footings of many of the buildings within the streets. But there's also sandstone was used, and that was the older sandstone, which forms the surface rocks in the eastern suburbs, and that was mined. There were quarries for that as well, and that was that was a nicer looking rock. So,
and interestingly, we've become so attached to this idea of Melbourne being bluestone city that we're now importing bluestone from India.
Right.
Because we're clearly getting low on the stock from the quarries.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the bluestone was useful also, of course. You could crush it up and use it to line the street to surface, mix it up with bitumen, and it becomes hard enough to carry regular traffic.
Yeah.
I mean, as I guess an extension of the discussion about quarries and so on, I'm also interested in the idea of lost landscapes as a way to understand, the fundamental aspect of human existence, which is a requirement to constantly modify the physical world. But in a country like Australia and the general region of Melbourne, that's shaped by millennia of indigenous land management, but then followed by over 2 centuries of continuous urban expansion, can we really speak of lost landscapes in a simple, nostalgic way, or should we approach this idea as a more layered, dynamic concept that is shaped by long histories of both deliberate intervention and also unintended consequences?
This is very complicated. The landscapes that were encountered by the Europeans, they took to be natural. And in the main, they were natural. One of the things that's always amused me is that when John Batman's party came and explored, what they saw on the western side of basically the western side of the bay, was a rolling grassland, which for sheep farmers, as they were, was basically heaven. And that led to the importation of literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of sheep. And with the subsequent pushing off their country of the First Nations people, in this case both Boonwurrung and Wurrung people, speakers, the sheep were left to graze. But what they did not know, what the Europeans did not realise, was that those grasslands were not a natural creation. They had been subject to a range of plant management, if you like, resource management practices by the people, principally what we used to be called fire stick farming. And the idea was that they would, at particular times, burn off small areas in order that the herbaceous species, principally those that had tubers, such as a thing called murnong, or yam daisy, lilies, orchids, this range of plants had tubers which were a very plentiful food source. And you could make the tubers grow bigger if you could allow more sunlight to fall on those areas. And so they burnt off anything that would have shaded those plants. And as a result, it's a rolling grassland rather than a shrubby area. It was never going to be a forest because in that area there isn't sufficient water. There's a few miserable streams, but and they had mature trees along the banks, but by and large it would have been a shrubby land which would have been useless for sheep farmers. Well, when the First Nations people were pushed off, naturally nature took its course, and the natural succession was that it returned to be as shrubland, which made it useless for the sheep farmers, and so they had to move somewhere else. So it's ironic in that way. In terms of lost landscapes, it's interesting that Europeans came to this area with a view about wetlands. I have a particular interest in wetlands because there aren't that many of them left. But the area of Melbourne, particularly the inner area of Melbourne, had a number of wetlands, which for the Europeans were no-go zones, largely because they still believed at the time that swamps, as they were referred to, were the source of disease. And so they stayed away. And sooner or later, Melbourne, of course, began to grow, and they had to start reclaiming that area. And so ultimately they've reclaimed the whole lot. And so what was a wetland immediately west of Melbourne, between the CBD and the Birrarung, something in the order of 30 acres of wetland is now totally reclaimed. Likewise, there were things like Sandwich Lagoon, there was a lagoon immediately on the lower ground behind Victoria Barracks. That was gone. Elwood Swamp had been reclaimed. These sorts of things. The only ones that remain for particular reasons are Albert Park Lake,
which was heavily engineered and modified to become
yes.
a lake.
Well, it's reasonably heavily modified, and saved really only because it was beloved by people who sailed boats. And the only other wetland that was close to the city that's still there in, once again, highly modified form is the ornamental lake in the Botanic Gardens. This was a freshwater lagoon of the Yarra, and when they straightened the river, they left the lagoon there, and it became separated and became the Botanic Gardens got a bit of extra land to the north and encompassed that area, which they turned into an ornamental lake. So there's no, the things that have changed in terms of landscape, when we talk about lost landscape, nobody would think of them as being lost, except nowadays when we create a new housing complex, people like to live near water. And so they, for example, out at on the western side of Melbourne, in the new housing developments, they've put in lakes where there never were lakes, and they've completely drained Carrum Swamp and then rebuilt a bit because, once again, people like to live near water.
The brilliant Judith Hayman, Berlin-based Australian cellist, improviser and organiser of sounds, made that piece, and it was called 17 Fabrics of Measure. So this conversation's been spanning back and forth millions of years, geological time, fire stick farming, what European arrivals might have seen. Many Melburnians are familiar with John Batman's phrase about Melbourne as being the place for a village.
Yes.
And of course, European settlement really took place prior to the birth or wide use of photography. So you started building up a picture of Melbourne sort of as the land that Europeans arrived in, the vegetation, landforms and so on. Maybe I'm sort of curious about the animal life that occupied the land. Kangaroos, platypuses, wombats, were they inhabiting the land in a way that we might, recognise? And perhaps going back even further, what kind of megafauna were occupying this area?
Right. Could I say, these are interesting things, but could I say before I answer your question, that the thing about Melbourne is that when, and the phrase, this is the place for a village, it's thought that he was, when Batman said those words or wrote those words in his journal, that he was actually on the site. But in fact he was on board ship, waiting for the weather conditions to improve so that he could actually leave the mouth of the river and sail back to Tasmania.
Right.
And when he said, this will be the place for a village, he presumably meant the area where the CBD now is. And this, of course, was people came over once the news got out. People like John Pascoe Faulkner sailed in. He set up, and other people followed, and they created a township on the northern side of the river, but it was illegal, of course. And the government sent down a party led by William Lonsdale to keep them in order. There were too many people there. By the time the government interceded, there were too many people and too many sheep to get them all off, send them all back to Tasmania or back to New South Wales, because some people had overlanded. So they made it official, in a sense, by sending a government party. Now, the government party wanted to set up in the area that we now know as Williamstown. But they found very quickly, and that was because that would give them ready access to the bay, and so for shipping in and out. Melbourne lies about 7 kilometres up the river, or did then, about 7 kilometres up the river. And what Lonsdale found very quickly was that there wasn't sufficient fresh water in the Williamstown area, so he had to give in and move his party to where the settlers were, because they had set up at the only place in the whole of the central Melbourne area at the top of the bay where there was sufficient fresh water. And it was only because of the falls, the rocky falls across the river that Christine mentioned earlier, that made the river fresh. The river is tidal, and so fresh water would flow right up the river, and people would not have been able to build there except for the falls. because the salt water, whilst it might go over the falls temporarily, the force of the river down would sweep it back as the tide went out. And so that was the place for a village. And so in a sense, the nature of the country and that rocky ridge that created a small little waterfall was a part of the newer basalts that flowed down the stream course of the Yarra. To answer your question, to get around to finally, because of the different surface, underlying surface rocks, you have different sorts of soils developing, and you have different sorts of vegetation growing. And of course, the two most important things in terms of studying the natural history of any place are the geology and the weather. And the geology of the area that I briefly described earlier created a situation where, from reading from the west, it was as flat as a tack on the western side, and as you crossed the river, it progressively got higher and higher, which meant, because our weather comes from primarily up from the southwest, that more rain was falling in the higher areas than was falling in the western side. There was also a rain shadow created by the Wurrungs. So what that meant was that the vegetation in, say, from about Box Hill onward to the east was increasingly denser forest until you get up into the Dandenongs, where it is closed forest. It's sort of open forest in Box Hill. From that point to the west, it becomes more open, and so you get open grasslands. And those grasslands, those open areas, were subject once again to a bit of resource management by the local people, and so they were kept in that way. Now, those different types of vegetation, of course, would attract different types of animals, different animals, because every animal has preferences in terms of where they can live. And the macropods, kangaroos, wallabies, need open area but to hop around in because they're grazers. But they by and large, when threatened, they will take shelter in forested areas. So you could find in the open areas, open forests, you will find the macropods will be living there rather than out on the open plains where there's no shelter. Emu are the exact opposite. They don't mind, the open areas. That they don't want forests because they don't find what they like to eat. Wombats need areas where they can dig their holes. So it has to be in areas where there's relatively deep soil. That precludes them from living in the western side because the underlying basalt on the western side of Melbourne and large parts of the northern metropolitan area it's relatively recent. When I say relatively, it's somewhere about 800,000 years. Now, in geological time, that's not very long, and so the soils that overlie the basalt on the western side are rich, undoubtedly, but they're not very thick. And this has all kinds of ramifications for both the vegetation and thus also the fauna that lives in these areas. It also has ramifications for building.
Which I'm discovering right now in a site near Donnybrook.
Right.
So there was, I mean, we often think of Melbourne as being a very sort of crude subdivision, the grid layout as a crude subdivision, but actually there was some thinking about its relationship to fresh water and so forth. We are running out of time, so I mean, I think I'd really curious to hear your thoughts about the future of this city and in relation to that deep history and the geological conditions and so forth. We see a lot of architecture and landscape architecture students over the years take inspiration from some of the natural features that we've been talking about today, such as the falls, also the creek that was underneath Elizabeth Street. I think it was called Williams Creek at some point.
Yes.
And this interest in, you spoke a lot about the wetlands, south of the CBD, west and so forth, right down to Albert Park Lake. I mean, have you got any thoughts about future Melbourne and how you would like the city to reshape and reimagine itself in the future in relation to this context of its history and its geological conditions and so forth?
I think the difficulty here, Christine, is that we have to be able to deal with the matter of the probability of increased rain. If climate change brings higher rainfall, then that has to be dealt with within the existing framework we have, which means, of course, probably bigger drains under the river, under the ground. There is a drain that runs down Elizabeth Street, underneath Elizabeth Street, which had to be made bigger after, I think, 1972.
Yes, after we got the big
yeah.
images of people swimming down Elizabeth Street after the big downpour.
Yes. As to the expansion, I mean, it's clear that, and it's been clear right from the very beginning of European settlement, that it's easier and more attractive to live on the eastern side of Melbourne. Easier because there are freshwater streams, and the soils are relatively deep, so people can have gardens. On the western side, it's harder to build there because you need to be able to dig foundations for houses. Technology is advanced enough to allow us to do that now, but really we're creating a false, well, I shouldn't say false, but we're creating an environment that never existed before by putting in ornamental lakes and this kind of thing. But the possibilities for expansion of the city really is only to the east and to the southeast.
Mm-hmm.
And and to the west to some extent. I mean, it's now, it's amazing the edge of the city in 1920 something. There was a real estate agent selling land on Geelong Road in Footscray, and it was virtually the edge of the city. There was nothing much, and it's the shape of the city tells you that that it's easier to build, or maybe easy is not the word. It's preferable, we'll say, and so everything about Melbourne, in a way, everything about Melbourne's history is related to the environment. Collingwood, Richmond, for example, used to be industrial areas because they're on the edge of the basalt plain, so nobody wants to live there. They use the river as a convenient culvert for getting rid of the rubbish until the 1880s. So I think the answer, whether we like it or not, and I have to say, just a personal note, I live in Box Hill. We've got the suburban rail loop running through Box Hill. I'm greatly in favour of a suburban rail loop, but I'm not in favour of an authority, which is the SRLA, having control of an area with a radius of 1.5 kilometres and changing the planning rules. And so we could end up with up to 6-storey buildings on either side of our house.
Well, I think time will tell how our future Melbourne develops, and I think there is a lot of interest from architects around the world in paying a bit more attention to a lot of things we spoke about today, and also gaining a knowledge of, we've, as Graham said, jumped back and forth across millions of years in this conversation. So I thank you for sharing that
You're very
knowledge
welcome.
with us today, and that's it from us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
You're hearing us thanks to the generous support of the Alistair Swain Foundation and the Armati University School of Architecture and Urban Design. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Wurrung and Wurrung language groups on whose unceded country we are recording this podcast, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Peoples of Australia who have been caring for the many layers of country for over 60,000 years.